For being here.
I'd prefer not to use the microphone if possible, so let me know if you can't hear me. Otherwise, I'll go on to that. Let me talk just a little bit about the packet, and then we'll get started. With the etudes, I've marked in the kind of the key at the top and suggested fingerings, which we will go over. I didn't write a whole lot about the etudes because I thought I would speak in terms of those today in aspects to that. Also, there's a lot of philosophy in the approach with the packet, which I'll talk about, for instance, in your etude number 30, which is your technical etude. Really, there's some very tricky things for your fingers, which we will go through about how to practice those, and it pretty much emphasizes also articulation. And one thing is that I emphasize and like to do with my students is extract the elements that are difficult out of the music and practice them separately so that the music does not suffer the burden of your, the troubles that you're having. For instance, I extracted the articulations out of Etude 30, and since it's in the key of E, put them on the key of E, full range scale. And so that you can be practicing these, which will help you develop as a saxophone performer, as well as help you facilitate practice in the etude without the etude suffering, some of the laboriousness of you trying to get your articulations together. In dealing with technique, I spend an inordinate amount of time as a teacher teaching students how to practice. So much of the problem, students come to me, from all over the place, working on their all-state stuff. They want to go to all-state, etc. And what I find is that there's not any little magic pill or any secret thing that I can give them regarding the etude or the piece. What I spend most of my time working on some fundamental aspects of the saxophone playing, and also how to practice, how to properly prepare for your performance or your audition. It's pretty unnerving. It's been a while since I've judged the competition, but you have your number, and they'll say, number 242 in the ready chair, number whatever in the performance chair, and you're kind of going, okay. Well, dealing with how to cope with that, how to prepare for that, how to practice for that is much of the game as the etude and the performance itself. I make a lot of sports analogies with my students, and since we have the Summer Olympics coming up, you figure these guys are preparing for their track meet or their hurdles for 4 years for that one 30-second race. And what do you see them do on that day of the race? You see them stepping through the procedure super slow. And that's how we have to practice. When it comes time to prepare for that audition, you've got to practice consistency, which is completely different. And that's why in the very back of the packet you'll see there's kind of a philosophy I have about different levels of practice. And one of the big mistakes that performers make is they might have a problem that is contextual or much more of a consistency problem, but yet they practice it on level 1. They kind of go back to that particular passage, turn it upside down, forwards and backwards, and change the rhythms around. They can play the passage, but every time they get to it, they gaff it. It's just a simple, a different aspect of how to approach the preparation. So that's what I chose to put into this packet and give you some of those philosophies. Technique, I put some of the rules that I use for fingering choices in here because they're not random. I kind of borrowed the idea and some of the examples to a certain degree from the Larry Teal workbook, but also inflected some of my rules on how I approach fingerings. These are ones that I recommend. I 100% believe in them. And I would say that probably 99.9% of my fingering choices follow the rules. That other little aspect, I may change the fingering just because for some reason it felt better at that point. And that's all of our prerogative. But the rules The rules are kind of made for you to be able to master, or for the student, depending on what your situation is. I know I've got probably some saxophonists in here that are preparing for the performance, and I know I've got educators who are going to be dealing with the students themselves. The main point and purpose of it is that you master all the fingering options. You know, I run into far too many students who say they're working on a piece, an etude, whatever it is, and they say, you know, Dr. Pluggy, whatever, I just can't seem to get this up to tempo, or I just can't seem to, you know, be consistent with it at tempo in some form. And I say, well, all right, play it for me. I look at it and I notice that they've chosen all the most difficult fingerings possible in their approach to the piece. And when we start to change those fingerings, all of a sudden things start to become a lot easier. What happens is, the philosophy is that you should be using the technically most proficient fingering in any given circumstance. I usually use the B flats, A sharps as a good example. I usually find people come up and, you know, they're really a side B flat person, or they're a bis B flat person. And in my philosophy, you should be able to use them both equally, and you use the technically most proficient one in any given circumstance. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we go through the etude. If you're not doing your scales full range, or you don't have your students do your scales full range, I would strongly recommend that you begin. And these, I've written out all 12 major scales with the technical or fingering philosophies implied as to what type of fingerings they should be using as they go through this. Creative practice techniques. These are the ones where we will again go through this as I'm going through the etudes to show and help your students and or you as a performer master the technical aspects of the etudes. Etude 30 presents a couple of measures that are very tricky for the fingerings, and these practice techniques will really help facilitate the learning and the mastery of these. Already made reference to the 3 levels of practice. This is something that I truly believe in. You can go away and think about it and go, wow, that's really cool, I agree, or wow, that's pretty silly, I don't get it. Whatever your purpose, but I strongly recommend that you go into that. Also, in closing, the mental game. I find the older that I get, the more that this animal has to be practiced than this animal. And find, you know, that it seems like where we're growing up and developing as students of the art, so to speak, we're always thinking about mastering the metal, you know, really churning it in the practice room, and there's no doubt that that has to happen and that has to go on. But you'll find that one of the things I say is, what's the one element that changes every single time you or your student puts the instrument in their mouth? Yeah, your reed can change and there can be some of that, but that's not what I'm talking about. The one element, the notes on the page have not changed. The saxophone fingerings have not changed. Everything stays the same from one time to the next except for your mental state. You know, a lot of times if you've had a great day and you're feeling great, you tend to play great. If you have a bad day, you tend to play poorly. As a musician, as a performer, we can't allow that to happen. We need to be very consistent and really thinking about the realizing and accepting the fact that you are going to get nervous. You're supposed to get nervous and it's not going to go away. So what you want to do is learn how to manage it, use it to your advantage, and work in those terms. I strongly recommend the book, The Inner Game of Tennis. They've actually come out with one now called The Inner Game of Music, but I actually prefer The Inner Game of Tennis. Okay? Getting right to the etudes. I'd like to start with, kind of dig into your 3rd page of the packet, start with number 19, just kind of as a warm-up. Your lyrical etude, this is going to emphasize tone quality, control, vibrato, and artistry. Really shows, I love this etude. It has pretty much a little bit of everything inside of it. The one thing that, or the 2 major points that I'd like to make particularly about this etude is understand that staccato means detached, not short. In French, it's le détaché. Just means separated. Does not mean that the note has to be short. So you interpret the tempo of the piece, the style of the piece, to figure out how much separation this note may have and how artistically. So be careful not for the staccato, not to be too short in this etude. My bigger point is whenever we have trills, any type of ornamentation in music, I'm really big into what I call unwarranted accent. Students and performers tend to put weight and heaviness and accent into their playing that there's no explanation for it in the music. There's no demand for it. There's no need for it. Why this becomes very appropriate to this etude is you'll often find whenever there's ornaments and trills that those tend to get accented and they jump out of the line. Although I am not a painter and I know pretty much nothing about painting, except for I know that they talk about the color palette, which applies to our etudes when we're trying to play expressively, and also the brush stroke. And what I think about, can I use the graphics here? I can. Yeah, it doesn't really work. What I think about when playing specifically a lyrical etude is a very smooth line. And what happens is if there's unwarranted accent, you've got that smooth line, it's like someone just bumped the artist's elbow and there's a jaggedness in the line that he's just trying to create. So you want to be very careful. I usually talk with the student about the fact that trills are an ornament. And in my opinion, they serve two different purposes. One, they can excite tension. It can be kind of a where the trill is really fast, kind of nervous, and it excites that tension that you're pushing, and then it releases and resolves. In this etude, we don't want that. The trills should be expressive trills. And so what you want to have the student do is try to start the trill slow. As they go through the etude, so that it's not the fast all of a sudden creates tension that you don't really want in the etude, and also you want to be careful that it doesn't have accent. I didn't come prepared today for like the definitive performances of these etudes, but I will play through them just to kind of give you an idea of what I'm looking for. On this etude, you'll see in the key that I put just a little circle above it as the indication that I use for the bis fingering. I usually, and if you look on the technical suggestions in the back, whenever the B flat stands alone, it's not preceded or followed by a B natural. I believe that bis is the technically most proficient fingering. I actually teach this as a hand position. Normally, our hand position may be up here. Whenever we're going to play something that is in one of the flat keys, I'll suggest the student just move their finger down into bis position. That way they've got it covered. Now, whenever there's a situation where there is a B natural either preceding or following the B flat, then obviously we need to be using the side B flat. Okay?